Hi, everybody. Welcome back to English 229. This is for our class for Wednesday, the 8th. So I hope you were able to use the last week to catch up with readings, get ahead with readings, and to also consider your first paper, which is at a due date of the 29th of October. And as you know, early papers are encouraged. And that said, I chose the 29th because that's about midway through the semester, so it would be a good idea to have some feedback at that point in terms of your writing. But I have rolling due dates, which means that you can submit in your paper after the 29th. But if you do so, please keep me apprised as to what's going on with your paper because as I said, midpoint in the semester, I'm hoping to be able to get some feedback for your writing. And where we left off was beginning to think a little bit about Edgar Allan Poe. And I gave you 4 short stories to consider. Not that these are the only Poe short stories that exist, but I think that these short stories will give you a good overview of Poe's works and also give you a good sense of what Lovecraft was talking about in supernatural horror and literature. And the 4 pieces are The Fall of the House of Usher, The Mask of Red Death, The Telltale Heart, and The Black Cat. So you can see in the notes below that I've got some points that I wanted to make about each. So we'll discuss that today. And we will also next class talk about Jekyll and Hyde. And this is a novella, so it's not quite as long as Frankenstein or other novels, but it is longer than short story, which is what we're reading with Edgar Allan Poe. And on our Monday class, it turns out that we will not be meeting because that is October 13th, which is a holiday, which is Native Indigenous Day. I will post on our Moodle site to remind you of that. So when we return the following Wednesday is when we will put some closure onto Edgar Allan Poe and begin our conversation about Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. And my suspicion is that you would devote paper number 1 to either Frankenstein or Poe or to Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. You've got a little bit of latitude when it comes to Poe because as a short story or a short story writer, obviously it's a very different kind of genre than a novel. So what you might want to do is compare and contrast two of Poe's short stories, or even perhaps talk about all of Poe's short stories that we are reading in this unit. Just keep in mind that whenever you add an additional piece to your writing, then that adds additional complexity. And what I had suggested as a paper topic was to consider the Emily Dickinson quote that one need not be a house to be haunted. But of course, you can come up with your own paper topic. But what you want to do is to make sure that you get that topic approved by me ahead of time. And if you don't write about Poe or Frankenstein, my suspicion is that you would be writing about Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. And our following text would probably be more appropriate for the second paper, which is very similar to the first paper, the difference being that the second paper would be focusing on some of the later texts in the semester. But it's basically the same exercise of approximately 4 to 5 pages, but as long or as short as it needs to be for you to defend your thesis. That it is a critical paper, so you would not be utilizing outside resources. You would be using basically the learning that you've experienced in this particular class. And you are going to have the opportunity to rewrite that first paper if you so desired, because I think of the first paper as a kind of learning exercise. Certainly, after I return your first paper, and if you are content with your grade, well, then you're done with the assignment. But if you wanted to try to improve your grade, anything lower than an A, you couldn't get a grade that's higher than an A. I know that sometimes there's conversation about A plus, but in my mind, A is the highest that exists. I've never quite understood the A plus myself personally. But nevertheless, if you earn a grade that's lower than an A, you always have the option to rewrite. I just ask that you take my comments into consideration, and reaching out to me is always a good idea to talk about revision. And I ask that you submit in the original version with my commentary on it, along with your revision, so I can compare and contrast. And you would have up until the ending of the semester to submit that, but certainly the sooner you submit it in, the better off everybody is. But to talk a little bit about Edgar Allan Poe, probably The Fall of the House of Usher is the most complex of the 4 short stories that I had assigned. And this house is both a physical structure, but it's also about the family lineage. And we learn through just the very beginning description what a master Poe is in terms of setting. It takes place in the fall, which is suggestive of descent and autumn. Poe is very poetic. The Raven is probably one of his most famous works, but even in his prose works, he's known for utilizing poetic elements such as alliteration, the initial repetition of consonant sounds. So we're told at the very beginning it's a dull, dark day. Notice all those D words, which also are suggestive of death. Isolation, as we've seen before and we will see again over the course of the semester, is always a bad thing in the world of the Gothic. One of the ways that the Gothic serves as a kind of instructional element is talking about the benefits and the positives of community. And when that community disintegrates, that's when individuals become vulnerable. But we know that the narrator is alone on horseback. He's going to the Usher house, which is also quite isolated. This is the house of an old childhood friend that he wasn't very close to, so it seems somewhat suspicious that he would be summoned to this particular house. Notice the narration is in the first person I, which makes it very subjective. Poe likes to use the first person I. One of the things Lovecraft talked about was Poe's use of psychological elements within his stories, and definitely the subjective narrator of an I lends itself to psychological analysis. There's oftentimes a lot of personification in Poe, giving human-like elements to inanimate objects. We see this with the description of the house with its eye-like windows. In fact, one of the things that Poe tends to like to talk about are eyes, so we will revisit this in some of his other short stories. Eyes are the window to the soul. You might have heard of the evil eye as well, and both of those are suggestive of not only psychological but supernatural possibility. Poe is filled with ambiguity, so you can grasp a supernatural conclusion or interpretation if you wanted to, but you can also grasp a psychological. I like to do both. I think both are possibilities at the same time. We're told in Poe about the sentience of all vegetable things, the idea that all things have some sort of element of awareness. And the drug references that Poe uses would suggest that these are somewhat autobiographical. After you had watched Poe's biography, you learned a little bit about some of his struggles with alcohol and drug use. He mentions opium in this particular text, but we'll be talking about alcohol in very shortly when we talk about the Black Cat. And the idea of Trinity, which is oftentimes religious when you think about Father, Son, Holy Ghost. In this instance, we have a trinity of a brother, a sister, and a house. And what is implied, what is suggested, it's never directly stated, is that the fall of the House of Usher is about a generational and family evil, specifically incest. The idea of unnatural sensations and acuteness of senses just kind of reinforces the idea that this is the ending of the line and Roderick is alone with his sister. And certainly there are elements of mental disorder here in this story, reference to hypochondria when we talk about Roderick. The atmosphere, very gothic. The architecture, the decayed trees, the fungi that are all described by Poe very much illustrate what we expect in the gothic tradition. And even the description of Roderick Usher, how he has a cadaverousness of complexion. I can't help but consider Frankenstein's creature and the parallels between the two. Madeline Usher is the deceased twin sister. Notice how we've talked about the idea of doppelganger or doubling in the Gothic. We saw that in Frankenstein. Definitely, we see this with the idea of the brother and sister in the fall of the House of Usher. One of my favorite parts of the story are the poetic elements of the haunted palace, where we have a poem that's embedded within the actual text itself. And we're told, but evil things in robes of sorrow assailed the monarch's high estate. A bit of foreshadowing of what's going to happen at the ending of this story. We know that Poe was afraid of premature burial, which was actually a valid fear during the time period. And it seems that Madeline was prematurely buried in the family vault, or there, of course, could be some sort of supernatural resurrection, or it could be a combination of the two. The result of that, as Madeline comes back, is the disintegration of the family lineage, but also the disintegration of the house. And that ambiguous ending with the fissure of the house and its collapse. Could it be supernatural? Could it be natural? Or some combination thereof? Then, when we move forward to another short story, such as The Mask of the Red Death, if you are a Stephen King fan, then you might know The Shining, where there are references to the Mask of the Red Death in The Shining. Unmask, unmask. The Red Death is representational of disease and plague. And obviously, red has lots of associations with blood, which is also associated with Christianity, the idea that the blood is the life, something that we will talk about when we talk about Dracula, for instance. And Prince Prospero, and you should be thinking of Prosperous at this point, is happy and dauntless and quite proud. Remember when we talked about this story during the height of COVID in my classes, and we talked about how the rich try to basically seclude themselves from disease and try to surround themselves with opulence, and neither were successful in some instances, and that's certainly what we're going to be finding here. We know that this party goes into deep isolation, and again, we know that that's a warning sign of trouble ahead. The idea of a masquerade ball, which I think is brilliant because they're hiding from reality, which is what you do in a masquerade ball. You hide behind a mask. And of course, the atmosphere, the Gothic architecture, right down to the 7 rooms that are described. And the 7 rooms could be reminiscent of the 7 deadly sins. All of the rooms have different colors, and the colors could be associated with the different sins of sloth and lust and gluttony, greed, wrath, envy, and pride. Of course, 7 is oftentimes seen as a lucky number, and we'll see how unlucky it is for these individuals. Or perhaps you might want to think about the 7 stages of life: infant, child, teen, young adult, adult, retirement, and then finally elderly. The colors that are referenced: blue, purple, green, orange, white, violet, black. Again, many of these colors can be associated with some of the deadly sins. So, for instance, green with envy might be an expression that you may be familiar with. And that ebony clock that's always ringing. The enemy is time. We oftentimes see this in Edgar Allan Poe, and oftentimes we see a capitalization of the word time by authors to illustrate its personification as a kind of enemy because it brings about death. At midnight, of course, it's a time of endings, but also a time of beginnings. And we see how darkness and decay is personified through basically what appears to be a masked reveler who could be the Red Death itself. The alliteration, we've seen alliteration in Poe's previous work: darkness, decay, dominion. Again, all suggested of death. And the ending, when the Red Death holds sway over all, is it literal? Is it figurative? Could it be both? And I've always liked the idea of both. Note the similarities between the Telltale Heart and the Black Cat. Again, both utilize the I narrator, something that we didn't necessarily see with the Mask of Red Death. And the first word in the Telltale Heart is true, which leads to the question of what is truth and can we determine what truth is? And of course, the narrator is tormented by an eye and the idea of eyes being able to see the truth, being able to see the soul. And of course, the evil eye that I was referencing earlier, that a look or a thought is capable of inflicting injury. So, reference to a vulture eye, the idea that a vulture is a bird of prey, all of this sets the atmosphere for the Telltale Heart. It's midnight, and death again is personified, and it's quite macabre. It's a dismembered corpse, after all, is what our narrator does, and trying to justify his behavior for murder. And we basically get the inner workings of a madman, which might be the most frightening thing of all, because what makes sense to someone who is insane does not make sense to someone who is sane. So the police are representative of moral authority as they come to investigate the possibility of a crime. And I believe I had mentioned that Edgar Allan Poe is attributed with creating the modern day detective story. So you oftentimes have those elements within some of his other tales as well. The idea of being able to discover the truth about some crime that's been committed. And of course, what we've got is a narrator that's filled with hubris and thinks that he's gotten away with his crime. And as macabre as it is, we aren't given gory details. We are going to have to wait until later in the semester to get our gory details. Something like The Exorcist is going to be what Stephen King calls the gross out. So while there is a certain element of the gory in Poe, he doesn't get into detail. Perhaps one of the reasons why Poe is a popular author in the junior high school and high school level. And the ambiguous ending where their telltale heart, and of course, the heart is supposed to be representational of the soul. Is it a supernatural element that this heart continues to beat on? Or is it just a figment of his imagination? Perhaps his own heart that's betraying his guilt? Or a combination of the two. And again, I like the idea of the combination of the two. And when we get to the black cat, of course, there's lots of stereotypical associations with black cats, especially in the Western tradition, where they're supposed to be representative of evil or perhaps a witch's familiar. It's not like that necessarily in all cultures. In Egypt, they're viewed as sacred and godly. And the narrator, once again, the I narrator, is an alcoholic. And of course, he's haunted by his alcoholism. Perhaps that's the biggest demon in this particular piece. And he's confessing before his execution. And he's going to be executed in the gallows, very appropriate, considering how the story unfolds. And he talks about the evil of alcohol, intemperance, the loss of reason, the meaningless violence, the self-destruction. And of course, he's got a black cat named Pluto. You know anything about Pluto, the Roman god of the underworld, the lord of death? Again, reference to an eye with the cat, and the eye is able to see the truth. And He talks a little bit, I think this is very psychologically astute, about the forbidden. We see a certain level of psychological astuteness in The Fall of the House of Usher when there's reference to hypochondria with Roderick. But we also see the same sorts of references to the psychological about how the human is perhaps seduced by, for lack of a better word, seduced by the forbidden, that he is tempted to commit a vile action purely because he's not supposed to commit it, which I think is very true in terms of temptation. And that image of the roped cat that he initially kills, in a fire, the fire is supposed to be reminiscent of hell. And we see the cat, the roped cat, hanging from a gallows, which is what's going to be happening with our narrator as well. Now, there's a second cat to replace the first cat that has been killed. The second cat is eyeless with a white splotch. Again, that idea of the doppelganger. And in a fit of drunken rage, it turns out our narrator ends up axing his wife rather than killing the cat. And while it's gruesome and graphic, not too gruesome and graphic, so again, probably appropriate for the junior high school or high school audience. He buries the corpse of his wife in the cellar, the idea that the cellar is a place where you keep secrets. And the police once again come about as the moral authority. And the idea of premature burial is certainly displayed with the cat, wherein these noises come out from the cellar wall from a narrator that once again is filled with hubris and arrogance and thinks he's gotten away with his crime. And that ambiguous ending that it could just be that the cat was walled in with the corpse, or it could be that this is a supernatural entity of cat, or both at the same time. After all, there were two cats. So for today's attendance question, what I wanted to ask you was something a little bit more specific about one of these 4 short stories. This will be due on Friday, the 10th of October. Certainly, if you need an extension, please let me know. Select a quote from either The Fall of the House of Usher, The Mask of Red Death, The Telltale Heart, or The Black Cat, and discuss why you think that particular quote is important. As you know, you're not required to respond to your peers, but you are encouraged to respond to your peers, much like you would respond to someone in a face-to-face class if you so had the desire to do so. But you are required to read your peer responses and my responses in turn. I'll be catching up with the attendance questions, responses that I haven't gotten to over the next several days. And what that will give you is a good overview of the kind of class discussion that we would have had talking about these stories. And as I indicated on Monday, we won't be talking about this because that is a holiday, but we will be putting closure onto Edgar Allan Poe on Wednesday, beginning Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, and continuing to discuss our paper. So again, I hope you use this past week efficiently and effectively. I hope you're doing well. I'm doing well. And we will continue on next class a week from today. Take care. Bye-bye.